Journalists are supposed to speak truth to power, but sometimes they fall short. Whether it's stealing the work of others or straight up lying about the facts, these high-profile journalists became the story when they violated all kinds of ethical standards. Terry Moran, one of ABC News' most accomplished journalists, served as a co-anchor and reporter for Nightline. Notably, Moran interviewed President Barack Obama 9 times and sat down with President Donald Trump in 2025. He generally kept an even hand and reported without revealing any of his personal biases or political preferences. Then, in a June 2025 post on X, Moran let his distaste for the Trump administration be known, calling out Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller as having a great capacity for hatred, and the president a world-class hater. Moran quickly deleted his postings, but they'd already been widely viewed. Within a day, ABC News moved to suspend Moran indefinitely, and days later he was fired. He told the New York Times, "I was thinking about our country and what's happening and just turned it over in my mind."
My own feeling is you don't sacrifice your citizenship as journalism, and your job is not to be objective.
Jayson Blair interned at the New York Times in the late 90s and was ultimately hired on as a junior writer. He was a prolific writer, turning in 600 articles in about 4 years' time. In October 2002, he was named a staff reporter on the national news desk. Just 7 months later, with discrepancies appearing in his work, Blair resigned his position. In one of the biggest controversies to ever hit the New York Times, a staff investigation found that he was more a fabulist than a journalist. Half of the articles he wrote as a staff reporter contained something untruthful. Blair claimed to have traveled to Maryland, Texas, and Virginia to write, research, and gather interviews for stories about the effects of the Iraq War on military families and the Washington, D.C. Beltway sniper case, but he hadn't left New York at all. Using details he spotted in news photographs of his subjects, he convincingly made his reporting seem real. Blair was also found to have invented or doctored quotes and taken passages from other publications and wire services and turned them in as his own work. When they went back to look at his early stories, Times staff found falsehoods in those pieces too.
I poured everything into journalism and I would lose it all, and I was losing it all.
About a year after he was ousted, Blair wrote Burning Down My Master's House, a memoir about his Times years and his bipolar disorder diagnosis. He later created the Depression Bipolar Alliance of Northern Virginia and became a mental health and life coach. Benny Johnson served as the viral politics editor for BuzzFeed in the 2010s. In July 2014, users on X started posting samples of Johnson's work at BuzzFeed that closely resembled previously published works composed by other authors. The online publication Gawker dug deeper and found that many of Johnson's articles had used phrases, sentences, and chunks of content from other publications without any credit. Johnson's most common sources were Wikipedia, Yahoo Answers, the New York Times, and U.S. News and World Report. BuzzFeed's editorial board quietly launched an internal investigation, and after examining 500 pieces written by Johnson, the team discovered that 41 articles published from January 2013 to June 2014 had been plagiarized in some way. BuzzFeed staff rewrote all 41 articles so they were 100% original reporting, and editor Ben Smith issued a public apology. BuzzFeed immediately fired Johnson. Johnson went on to become an independent online journalist unaffiliated with any major news organization and a political podcaster.
Thank you, BuzzFeed, in a way, because by firing me, you actually liberated me.
Fresh out of college in 1995, Stephen Glass got a job as an editorial assistant at The New Republic, and soon he became an associate editor. He built a following for his richly woven stories populated by highly realized characterizations of his subjects. One such article in that style was a May 1998 piece called Hack Heaven, in which Glass profiled 15-year-old computer hacker Ian Restel. Restel had allegedly been hired as a security consultant by Cooke after he'd remotely breached its network and extorted its executives. He also attended a convention held by the National Assembly of Hackers. Forbes digital tool reporter Adam Penningberg pitched a follow-up on Restel, but found that he couldn't verify a single thing mentioned in Glass's piece. Instead, Penningberg wrote an expose, and his publication alerted the New Republic lead editor Charles Lane. Lane discovered that Glass made up pretty much everything in Hack Heaven, and had also concocted fake evidence to bolster his lies. Restel didn't exist, and neither did Cooke or the National Assembly of Hackers, although Glass built a website for the former and printed a newsletter for the latter. A look at Glass's other stories revealed similar creative liberties. The journalist was fired, and after attending law school and passing the bar, he worked in a low-level position at a firm specializing in injury cases. Mike Daisey is a monologist, meaning he delivers monologues about social and cultural issues. In January 2012, he performed a portion of his one-man show, The Agony and the Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, on public radio's highly rated and much downloaded show and podcast, This American Life. Well over 1 million people experienced Mr. Daisey Goes to China, a segment in which Daisey, a self-professed enthusiast for Apple products, talked about visiting some factories in China. They were operated by electronics contractor Foxconn, where iPhones are manufactured. Daisey soon rethought his Apple fandom after witnessing the subhuman and degrading working conditions he saw at the plant.
Foxconn is an especially brutal company.
Well, the public radio show Marketplace interviewed the interpreter Daisey had used on his factory visits, and they said Daisey stretched the truth quite a bit. Not only did he lie about how many factories he visited and workers he talked to, but he also said he met the victims of a poisoning accident. That occurred, but not at a facility Daisey visited. Furthermore, the climactic moment where Daisey presented a finished iPad to a Chinese worker who had never even seen one before was total fiction. This American Life issued a retraction of the story. Daisey continued to perform monologues, but not for This American Life, and shifted his focus to less controversial topics. In early 1980, Washington Post reporter Janet Cooke published a lengthy and harrowing feature story called Jimmy's World. The piece was about the crime and drug problems raging through inner Washington, D.C. at the time. It was also a profile on an 8-year-old boy. Identified only as Jimmy, he was living amongst many daily dangers and hopelessly addicted to heroin. The piece became a local sensation, and D.C. Mayor Marion Barry and city officials all vowed to find Jimmy and give him the help he needed. In April 1981, Cooke won a Pulitzer Prize for Jimmy's World. At this point, the Post's ethics officer noticed that the bio the author sent to the Pulitzer Committee differed from the one she'd given her employer. That cast doubt on the legitimacy of Cooke's work, and questions had already been raised after no one in the D.C. government had been able to find Jimmy. Cooke finally confessed she'd made the whole thing up. She was ultimately fired. In the pre-cable and pre-internet world, CBS's Dan Rather was one of the most influential figures in television news. Succeeding the beloved Walter Cronkite in 1980, Rather starred on and helped run CBS Evening News for decades. He dutifully delivered the news while also investigating and reporting his findings, including a bombshell 2004 story on President George W. Bush, who at the time was up for re-election. Other news entities had looked into the Commander-in-Chief's term of service in the Texas Air National Guard in the 1970s and if he'd landed a plum and privileged assignment because he was from a powerful and wealthy family. But Rather appeared to blow the story open. He and producer Mary Mapes discovered documents allegedly generated by Bush's commanding officer. They indicated that the future president didn't have to endure a medical check and enjoyed glowing evaluations he didn't necessarily earn. After Rather shared his findings, watchdogs called the documents into question. They suggested the information had been faked on account of how a typography looked like it was generated by a modern computer, not a typewriter. At first, CBS stood by Rather and his work, but after it became clear that the documents couldn't be verified, it ordered him to kill the story. Mapes was fired, and on March 9, 2005, Rather appeared on his final broadcast of the CBS Evening News.
We reported a true story, and that's the reason I'm no longer at CBS News.
Jack Kelley began filing stories for USA Today in 1993, rising to the rank of foreign correspondent. It's tough being a reporter in a war zone, and in 2001, his first-person description of a suicide bombing landed him on the Pulitzer Prize shortlist. A decade into his tenure at USA Today, it became clear that Kelley was a serial fabricator and fictionalizer. In early 2004, after editors followed up on a lead that Kelley may have falsified some stories, the reporter confessed to taking unethical liberties with a translator and resigned. 9 writers and editors then examined 720 Kelley stories published over the previous decade and found mistruths and falsehoods in 100. Hotel and phone records proved that he hadn't been in many of the places he said he traveled to. Evidence recovered from his company laptop indicated that he'd coerced quotes by writing up scripts for what he wanted said and then got his associates to say them. Kelley had never been embedded in a terrorist cell or a group hunting Osama bin Laden, never saw a terrorist hatch a plan to attack the Sears Tower in Chicago, and never explored a terrorist camp in Afghanistan. Kelley retired to private life after the scandal and has quietly volunteered with charitable organizations. By age 24, Ruth Shalit had worked for several of the country's most prestigious news outlets and had been named an associate editor at the New Republic. In 1994, the publication discovered that her story about youthful politicos in the administration of President Bill Clinton contained lengthy passages lifted from a Legal Times article. Then, parts of a National Journal profile on presidential candidate Steve Forbes appeared unchanged in another Shalit piece. Shalit claimed that she'd accidentally plagiarized twice because she'd mistakenly published her notes instead of the completed articles. After more accusations of plagiarism and quote embellishment, Shalit exited the New Republic in 1999 but managed to publish again, albeit under her married name of Ruth Shalit Barrett. More than 2 decades removed from scandal, Barrett landed a piece on the link between obscure high school sports and Ivy League college admissions in a late 2020 issue of The Atlantic. The publication soon had to post an explanation on the digital version of the story, telling readers that the piece could be misleading. One source Barrett interviewed, a parent who went by Salone, turned out to not have a son at all. The Atlantic ultimately cut ties with Barrett. On April 21, 2013, Bismarck, North Dakota NBC affiliate KFYR began its live broadcast of the Sunday night edition of its flagship newscast, Evening Report. It marked the debut of the station's newest anchor hire, the just-graduated A.J. Clemente. Nerves likely played a factor in Clemente monumentally bungling the story, making a couple of unforced errors that resulted in a famously terrible on-air news blooper. After Clemente read off of a script to tease a couple of stories the program was about to cover, the announcer took over to introduce the show. Immediately thereafter, and with his microphone live, Clemente muttered a series of expletives.
Good evening, I'm Van 2.
He then kept mumbling as his co-anchor Van 2 attempted to introduce him. When given the chance to speak again, he garbled his words, but at least he didn't swear.
Thanks, Van. I'm very excited. I graduated from West Virginia University, and I'm used to, from being from the East Coast.
After turning out what is probably the worst and most profanity-addled first broadcast performance in TV news history, Clemente was fired by KFYR within hours. After his unfortunate viral moment, Clemente went on to become a bartender in Delaware.